So, some complaints about what the Central Committee's communiqué did not address. To tell us about those and others, we have Mary Kay Magistad with us in the studio. Mary Kay has just completed her assignment as China correspondent for Public Radio International's The World program. Welcome to LinkAsia.
Thank you.
An issue that Chinese media have been looking into and talking about for a long time is the Hukou system. That's the household registration system. And people are having a very hard time getting access to social services when they move. We're talking about tens of millions who have flooded the city looking for work. In the communiqué, is there anything that addresses reforming the Hukou system?
The Hukou system was not specifically mentioned in the communiqué. Now, there's going to be another document that will be issued in about a week that may go into more detail. But there has been some disappointment from those who had hoped that the Hukou system reforms would be put forward this time around. Basically, the urgency in this is that the government is saying that it now wants to encourage more urbanization. Already, China is more than 50% urban. But if you look at Shanghai and Beijing, two of China's biggest cities, almost half of the population in each place does not have a Hukou for the place where they live. What does that mean? It means that if migrants move to Beijing or Shanghai and bring their kids, the kids can go to school up till 9th grade, but then they have to go home to the villages to go to high school and take the college entrance exams, and then they have to get a higher score in the villages than the kids who grew up in Beijing do to get into the top schools. And one thing that was mentioned in the communiqué from the party plenum was, we do have to address social contradictions. We have to address income disparity. And Xi Jinping, president party, head of the party, has managed to get more discretionary authority to be able to make some of those tough decisions. The question is, will he make them in a direction that people find moves China toward being a more equitable society, or will he mostly protect the party's power?
And speaking of social contradictions, which you brought up, something else I wanted to ask you about is that another part of the communiqué talks about a new national security committee to address just that, resolving social contradictions. What do you think that means for opening up the political process and the media?
There have been no indications that the current leadership wants to open up the political process or allow more media freedom. To the contrary, there have been many signs that the party wants to clamp down on critics and make it clear that there is a unified line, a way that people should be thinking, everyone marching forward in lockstep, in unison. And I think if you're an intellectual or a journalist in China today, a Chinese journalist, it's much tougher now than it was even a year and a half ago under Hu Jintao.
So then what is the point of this National Security Committee?
Well, it's not quite clear yet how it will function, but early indications are that the executive, Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, want to be able to make their own decisions without having to do quite as much horse trading as party leaders have had to do over the last two generations. So on the one hand, Xi Jinping can say, okay, the buck stops here, I'm making the decisions. On the other hand, this could lead to a concentration of power and a more authoritarian government, which might not really be the best thing for a Chinese population that's becoming more affluent, more sophisticated, and more demanding of their government. They want a different kind of relationship with their government, one with more give and take, where the government listens to them. And it doesn't sound from this communiqué like that's the direction that the party's interested in going in right now.
So a lot of promises, but who knows if they'll deliver. Mary Kay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Find out more about Mary Kay Magistad by going to our experts page. The economy was front and center in the plenum's final communiqué. As we saw earlier, it calls for a decisive role for the market. But the communiqué also says public ownership is a basic pillar of the economy. To explain this apparent contradiction, we have veteran China correspondent Francisco Sisci with us on Skype from Beijing. Sisci is a columnist for the Italian business daily Il Sole 24 Ore. Thanks for coming on LinkAsia. So the market is decisive, but on the other hand, the regime is also saying that public ownership is a pillar. What does that tell you about which direction China is going to take?
The communiqué uses two different verbs to explain the role of SOEs and the role of private companies. For SOEs, it says 推动, that is mobilize, move up, change, shape up. That is, in other ways, SOEs will be changed, will be reformed. Private enterprise will be 支持, that is supported, sustained, so that the state will support private companies and will reform state-owned.
So then what do you think will happen to the state-owned enterprises? After all, they employ 20% of workers, and many of those owned by the central government are actually profitable.
Actually, possibly two things. One thing we know for sure, because it's been announced in the past days, more private capital will be invested into the SOEs. Plus another thing which is possible, likely, that is now some of these state-owned are huge conglomerates, huge holdings, having banks, insurance, maybe auto deals. These huge holdings could be broken.
So you sound rather optimistic that these changes can actually happen, that it's not just a plan and a promise that will never reach reality.
Well, I think what happened with this plenum, and I think is the most important thing, is that no big reforms, concrete reforms have been announced, but the top leadership, in a way, has doted itself with instruments, with tools that can plan, enact, and implement reforms. And I'm quite optimistic that the top leadership wants these reforms because it knows that either it reforms the economy or China in 10, 15 years will become some kind of second USSR. And the top leadership doesn't want that.
Okay, all right, we'll see if those tools are up to the task. Thank you. Francisco Sisci is a longtime Beijing correspondent. So overall, what does Xi Jinping and the rest of the leadership want to do, and can they do it? Bob Kapp is the former head of the U.S.-China Business Council and consultant for companies wanting to do business in China. We asked him first whether there's enough in the communiqué to give us a clear roadmap for the next 10 years.
This communiqué, which we all waited and waited and waited for, and for which there was so much hype coming out of China in advance, this communiqué is just a dog's breakfast, if you will. I mean, an absolute melange of just about everything you could imagine. And one of its characteristics is that in typical dialectical fashion associated with the Marxist tradition of thinking, it balances the one side on the other constantly. This document has paragraphs of 15 and 20 lines with no periods in them, just listing phrase after phrase after phrase after phrase separated by semicolons about what they want to do. And frankly, I think you'd have to be wiser than anyone in this country or in China, with the possible exception of the top leaders, to know of that huge list of things that gets rolled out line after line, semicolon after semicolon, which ones are more important than which others.
And what can stop reform?
Even if the party is able to say, okay, we've really done the numbers, we've ground it all up in the mixer, you know, we've produced the sausage, here's the result. These are the top 5. We're going to act in the following way. Then comes the process of implementation. And just as there has undoubtedly been, I mean, there has to have been a huge debate among people whose interests are not identical. Personal interests, family interests, organizational interests, not identical in this Central Committee meeting and in the making even of this communiqué. So after the communiqué, so after the detailed decision comes out, there will continue to be the process of making the decisions stick, as I've talked about before on LinkAsia broadcasts, making the decisions stick down a system, a top-down system with, among other things, 31 provinces, 3,000 counties, and tens of thousands of townships to which all of these decisions have to be spread. So it's always going to be tough.
That was Bob Kapp, former head of the U.S.-China Business Council. He's also a LinkAsia advisor.
Now on U.S. airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories. World news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.